Joining us today, some really sharp minds and committed activists who played really important roles in different states and cities on the open primaries issue this year.
We made it about their freedom to choose any candidate they want in every election, which they used to be able to do, and they were now able to do again. So I think that resonated a lot with voters.
We were just very scrappy. We said we are going everywhere to everyone. There were people that say, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. No one's ever knocked on my door.
Wow.
I was like, yeah, we're here now. That was part of our tagline. Make them work hard for your vote.
It's really what makes America special, is that we are independent. We are individual. We are a country that empowers individuals, and our election system no longer does that. It rewards conformity.
I had so many people say, I was with you. I totally get all the good arguments. There are many good arguments for this. But then when I got home, I had a kind of a hard time explaining it to my family. And I think this was a real stumbling block in Arizona. I think we have an ongoing educational challenge.
Seems to me that the critical combo is years of public education, then you run a campaign, followed by years of public education. Welcome, everybody. I'm John Updike, president of Open Primaries. Joining us today, we're very lucky during this holiday season to have some really sharp minds and committed activists who played really important roles in different states and cities on the open primaries issue this year. Lisa Rice from All Votes Count DC, Juli from Alaskans for Better Elections, and Chuck Coughlin and Sarah Smallhouse from Make Elections Fair, Arizona. Before we open it up, I want to show just a quick video that shows them in action this past campaign season. So go ahead, Russ, cue the video.
Political activists looking to shake up Arizona's election system.
Primaries and ranked choice voting could completely change the election landscape in Nevada.
Montana's elections could look very different.
Proposition 1 will now move before Idaho voters on November 5th.
And Make All Votes Count DC, a ballot initiative 83 on the ballot.
One of the most impactful ballot initiatives all Colorado voters will see is the open primary and ranked choice voting measure.
The people of Alaska, we have the right to vote for who we want to vote on that ballot.
The political system is really underserving the greatness of our country.
If you want to have a healthy democracy, you want participation, particularly participation by people who want to vote.
Today is a milestone. We have done a fabulous job of hitting every single county in the state of Idaho and getting support for open primaries.
Montanans for Election Reform ultimately argued that these two ballot measures will help reduce polarization in politics, less money in politics, and give Montanans candidates that more accurately represent their views and not the views of special interest groups.
Nearly 40% of Nevada voters are not registered to one of the two major parties. That's the largest voting bloc in our state.
There is a grassroots effort to change the primary voting system in South Dakota.
I can't think of a more important right for South Dakotans than the right to vote.
My voice is needed. So I feel that my voice needs to be heard equally as everyone else's voice.
When I realized that I couldn't vote in a primary, my reaction was, it's bullshit and I'm going to change it.
I don't need anyone to tell me that I have to think either A or B.
Wow, it's hard to believe that was just a month ago. It feels like a whole different election cycle. But thank you, Juli, Lisa, Sarah, and Chuck for joining us. I want to get to, I'm sure people and the audience today have lots of questions. I want to get there very quickly. Let me start off with you, Juli. You led the successful effort to prevent a repeal of open primaries and ranked choice voting and campaign finance disclosure in Alaska. You won by 800 votes, 900 votes, right?
743.
Wow. I mean, it's a razor's job well done. And I saw this morning, there's a newspaper, there's already two separate efforts to overturn it again in 2026. So tell us about this campaign, what went right, and what is this treadmill of constant efforts to overturn it? What's driving that? What's happening politically around this up in Alaska?
Well, I think on the open primaries front, we started with a bit of a, oh, I can never remember how to do this, tailwind, right? Because we already had open primaries in Alaska for a long time before the 2020 election reinstated them, really. It was a blanket primary before, but we
Right.
have an electorate, 60% of us are independent voters. They were all used to being able to vote in the primary, and then it got shut down, and then they had to choose and limit their choices. And so the good news is, and I think that this is why it resonates so much with Alaskans, is that we made it about their freedom to choose any candidate they want at every election, which they used to be able to do, and they were now able to do again. And I think for those voters that had been used to open primaries before, they understood it. And I just think that, appealing to that just very basic ability to, you don't have to choose and limit your choices anymore. You don't have to choose a ballot. You can just vote for anybody you want, which is how we've done it for the majority of our statehood. So I think that resonated a lot with voters. And I think that our challenge is that it was the ranked choice voting aspect of it for us. There are people who believe that ranked choice voting is too complicated for Alaskans, even though the proof is in the pudding, and we've shown that people can navigate the ballot, and 99% of our ballots were valid in our first election. So I think our real challenge was the misinformation about what ranked choice voting does, how open primaries work, and the fact that people had forgotten, or people that were new to Alaska had forgotten, that really open primaries are really part of our historical voting culture.
Got it. So you guys combined open primaries, ranked choice voting, and campaign money disclosure. What advice would you give to people around the country as you're evaluating what things to put together or whether to put them together? And I know Alaska's a very unique state, so I'm not saying this should be universal truths here, but what are some thoughts you have about that?
And I'll say that I think every state has its own unique voting culture. And when we looked at what the reform did for us, like I said, we had already had open primaries. We have a rich history of independent and third party choices at the ballot. And so we've seen vote splitting. We've seen races won by one vote. Obviously, I think that it's true in every state. They don't really like to see a lot of money pouring in that is unsourced into their elections. So I think that understanding what the big issues are for your state and what is going to rally your people, and what are the things that they really care about, is going to tell you how to put those pieces together. I think that one of the lessons that we learned coming into this, and I know we'll talk about this as we talk about as people win and protecting that win, is that we really should have taken a little bit more time, I think, after that 2020 election, and just made sure people understood what the power of the open primary and ranked choice voting were, because we kind of won the election, and a lot of people remember the dark money part. And then the election, we did voter training in 2022, but I feel like there was a missed opportunity right after in 2021 just to take that victory lap and say, hey, you guys voted for voter freedom, and you voted to get rid of spoiler candidates, and you voted for majority support. Because I feel like one of our challenges also was, after the first election, people saw the one result and they'd kind of forgotten, we didn't have majority support requirements before. And they saw one result and they said, oh, I didn't like that one result. And I think that that's what caused a lot of our backlash, is people seeing a result they didn't like in that election and not remembering what the changes were really about.
Yeah. It seems to me that the critical combo is years of public education, then you run a campaign, followed by years of public education. None of this stuff is like minimum wage increase or something where it's a simple policy that people can just grapple with very easily. Lisa, in Washington, D.C., you, I think the correct term from the dictionary is you crushed it. And got 75% of the vote. I just, every time we got of a phone call or Zoom, I just loved hearing all the stories about going toe to toe with some corrupt Democratic Party politician who was saying, vote no. And you guys just like, you went out swinging. Two
did.
questions. How did the voters, I mean, obviously you won, so we know how they responded to you numerically, but how did they respond to you subjectively to this fight? That's first question. And the second one is, how do we use this win in Washington, D.C. to grow the national conversation and the national movement?
Yeah, so the going toe to toe, it's very interesting. The DC State Democratic Committee, so that's the official Democratic Party in DC, said no to ranked choice voting a cycle ago. And then their chair came out when we proposed this legislation, their chair came out and said, oh, we've already voted no on it. Well, that began a whole stink within the Democratic Party because they had not done that vote during the current cycle. So then they started infighting, which is the best thing for us.
Right.
So they started the infighting. Wait a minute, we didn't vote on that, this, da, da, da. So that was an undercurrent happening on the side. But, you know, this movement, and people say, you know, what was one of the keys to success? One of the keys to success was the failure of a ranked choice voting legislative act in 2021 through the council. And it failed, but it helped shape the legislation better, and adding on the semi-open primaries so that independents could vote in the primaries, I believe strengthened it. And so we were in the community very early against advice of some deep-pocketed would-be donors who would not donate to us early because they said we were doing, you know, we would have the wrong kind of victory, or we were doing coalition building too early. That is so wrong. You cannot start building coalitions too early. And so we were just very scrappy, and we had someone in the community. A lot of politicians in DC, when they're running citywide, choose not to focus on a couple of areas that are Blacker and poorer. And we did not take that stand. We said we are going everywhere to everyone.
It's great.
And we, from the beginning, blanketed all 8 wards of the city, and it was unlike anything that had been done. And so when we were knocking on doors and canvassing in the 2 wards that are generally sort of overlooked, there were people that say, you know, I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. No one's ever knocked on my door. I was like, yeah, we're here. We're here now. So we really upended the way campaigns speak to people. Yep. And proved to the establishment that the problem is that you're lazy. we weren't shy about saying it. You know, you've got to work hard. We told them you got to work hard, and that was part of our tagline: make them work hard for your vote. Yep. No one heard about our campaign without us saying make them work harder.
I love that. That's so great. It's yeah, because too often the reform community, my experience is we're vulnerable to talking about the benefits of the reform in and of itself, as opposed to how it's going to change our relationship to our elected leaders.
We talked about holding politicians accountable, making them work for your vote, and that really got the conversation going in a way that, so it wasn't just so nerdy about, oh, how does this work? But also, one thing that we pointed out, and folks just didn't know, they didn't know that the Democratic primary was paid for by all taxpayers. And when we said, look, we're not asking for anything special, we're asking for access to something that all of us pay for. And that was news to a lot of people. a lot of people thought that the Democratic Party paid for their own primary and thought we were trying to intrude on this, private group thing.
Private
And
election, right?
right. And we're like, oh, no, 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 we all pay for it. And that just changed people's minds.
Right.
They
That's right.
still sort of felt it was like, but I'm not so sure about these independents, but you're paying taxes and you're paying for the election. So sure, you ought to be able to vote in it.
Cool.
They were very jazzed about the fairness of it.
Yeah, that's great. That's interesting. Chuck and Sarah, so 2 questions for you. How do we start breaking through in big states? You guys ran a great campaign. You got 42% of the vote against unbelievable odds. I mean, just the legal challenges alone, the disinformation, all of it. Arizona it's not a city. Lisa, in some ways, got to work in a city. It's not kind of a low population. It's like it's where everybody in America is moving, and it's big and it's boisterous and it's a presidential swing state. How do we start tagging some victories in states that look more like Arizona? What do you think about that?
Sarah, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
Well, you can start.
I think Lisa just hit on it. Lisa just hit a bunch of messaging points that we know that work. It's a civil rights issue. I mean, this is a civil rights issue. This is a ballot access issue. It's a matter of treating everybody equally. It's not for the Democrats. It's not for the Republicans. It has nothing to do with them, other than to say that I'm not, and I want to participate, and I'm paying for their election. So why can't I participate? Why can't I choose, who I vote for? Why are you forcing me to vote for one party or the other? I told multiple stories to people this time. I mean, I'm running the campaign, and I had a guy running in a competitive congressional district that I live in, knocked on the door, and he was working for a Democratic candidate. I go, no, I like your candidate, but I'm not going to vote for him because I'm going to vote for somebody else who's a friend of mine that's running in that Democratic primary. I no sooner Luke closed the door than I said, well, shit, I can't. I literally can't, because I'd already requested a Republican ballot because I wanted to support Stephen Richer, who was our county recorder here, who was under fire, and some county supervisors who had been under fire. So, I mean, those kind of real life stories, when you can translate those to voters, I pay for an election I can't vote in. I'm paying for an election where you're forcing me to choose one side or the other. That's just not American. That's just not, I mean, those grand themes of the civil rights movement should be the themes of this effort. It's not about partisan politics.
Chuck on that. But I also think that there was a lot of people that election reform just was not the red meat they cared about in this election. And I'm kind of with Julie in that I think we have an ongoing educational challenge. We have to start now building those coalitions, doing the education work. We need to win, and then we need to keep educating. This is just, I had so many people say, I was with you. I totally get all the good arguments. There are many good arguments for this. But then when I got home, I had a kind of a hard time explaining it to my family. And I think this was a real stumbling block in Arizona, because literally every presentation I gave, the worst skeptic was won over. Well, maybe there was one.
Right.
But it's really, and even if our main campaign message was make elections fair, that's not wonky. That's back to Lisa's idea of like, if we're paying for the election and we're as much of a citizen as everybody else, we ought to be able to vote. But even that didn't seem to move the independents in as strong a way as I thought it would. Because it's the same thing. Everybody's paying for elections here. And that is, I think, Chuck, that tested as high as almost any argument we hold on, is the business about paying for elections and being excluded. So, but I think it has to be ongoing. It's not a campaign. It's bigger than a campaign.
Right. Yeah, particularly in Arizona. I mean, between Labor Day and Election Day, I mean, you guys couldn't be heard. There was just such an onslaught of presidential and both parties coming out against you. I mean, you would have needed $500 million and 10,000 door knockers. You know?
Our original plan was not to be so significantly opposed by the Democratic Party. The governor here made a choice to do that. And funded not only the opposition, but the legal challenge. They ended up spending in excess of $2.5 million and kept us in court until October 4th. Well, early ballots drop in Arizona on October 9th.
Wow.
So any opportunity for us to frame the issue, because that court case was determinative if our votes were going to be counted. And we didn't get that clarified till October 4th. So we lost that post Labor Day until October 1 period, where all of those national campaigns really aren't vocal then. You have sort of a glassy environment between Labor Day and October 1, where those communication pools aren't polluted. And it was our plan to go up in that period of time and talk about what Sarah just talked about, talk about what Lisa just talked about, talk about how this is a civil rights issue, this is a equality issue, this is requiring every voter to be treated equally. It's an American premise that justice requires equality. And we completely lost that entire opportunity because we were in court until October 4th.
Wow. I hear all of you in different ways saying, you know, education, early engagement, early coalition building, that's all key. So let me ask a hard question. So America is complicated. There's lots of things going on. I don't want to be reductionistic, but one of the things that's going on is a severe erosion of trust in institutions. You know, people see drones over New Jersey and they're like, what the hell's going on? You know, we went through COVID. There's just a lot of, not just in the electoral arena, but in life, a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust. And my question to you is, how do we do the most effective educating in that environment? Do we have to simultaneously build trust and do education? Is the building of the trust the education? Is the education the building of trust? What, am I mixing apples and oranges? How do you think about doing organizing in this political climate? I said it was going to be a tough question.
Yeah, I'll take a shot. I think it starts, as I'm convinced now, we in Arizona, I can't speak to everybody else, but I need a stakeholder. I need a Democratic stakeholder that's in elective office today. We had two of them. We had the Attorney General and we had the Secretary of State who were supportive of us, but they didn't want to be vocal out there because of the governor's position and others. But if we're to do this again, you have to have a Democratic stakeholder in Arizona to do this. I'm trying to build that right now. You know, you'd have to have a Ruben Gallego, who's 6 years away from a reelect campaign, say, I get it, you know, that this is about equality. This is a civil rights issue.
Right.
This is treating every voter the same. And then build around that, that stakeholder. Because, you know, the Electoral Coalition, in order to win, is a 60% plus unaffiliated voters in Arizona, 55 to 60% of Democrats, and then you're going to lose Republicans with 45%. That's a high water mark, maybe 45% of Republicans supporting you. But it has to start somewhere, and it has to start, in my view, with that narrative that the Democratic Party's always embraced is ballot access. because this is a ballot access argument, and this is core to them. And as I don't know what the Democratic Party stands for today. I have no idea what that's going to be in 2026 and what their message is going to be. If this wanted to be a part of that message, it would significantly help them in cycles and beyond in giving themselves an opportunity to market to unaffiliated voters. But you're right, John. Most people today, I mean, MAGA properly understood is alienation. It's alienation of a culture from its own institutions. And he's a vocal messenger on that. And we see that all throughout society. And so, this trying to build togetherness around American fundamental ideas of equality and justice, I think can resonate, but you have to have, it's not about election reform. It's about fairness, it's about equality, and it's about justice.
Yeah.
And I have, John, I had one quick follow-up
Julie.
and a comment on this is one of the things is we talk about civil rights and access to the ballot, but one of the arguments that I found resonated with a lot of Alaskans, because we have a lot of really close races here, is that having the closed primary actually keeps part of your constituency from being able to hold you accountable. If I'm not the same party as my elected official and I don't get to vote and they get voted out in the primary, it actually takes away my right as their constituent to hold them accountable for their actions. So we found that the ballot access worked, and also just saying that because we had a couple of our folks that had just been primaried out by about 14 votes in a very, very small, right before the reform took effect. But in answer to your current question, I think that, this is where the coalition building and education for us really went hand in hand. We really decentralized and went out to have everybody talk to their folks. And it goes hand in hand with what Lisa was saying, is there were constituencies that had not been talked to, and just being able to get them to understand how this was a civil rights issue for them, and taking that to, we were in the Korean paper. I went to all of the youth BIPOC events, and everywhere that I could go to find a messenger for that group. We really, really just tried to get, kind of a, one person in each, and not a geographic community necessarily, but in all of these communities as their trusted messenger, getting them on board and talking directly to their constituencies. And that seemed to really help get us, get us in places where the door was not necessarily open to Juli Lucky from No on to.
Yeah, Julie, you hit on something, because we found people from different communities, so formerly incarcerated, returning citizens, actually became such a big part of our coalition. The League of Women Voters of DC registers incarcerated to vote, and DC incarcerated federal prisoners are all over the country, so many of them register as independents. They get out, they come home, they're ready to vote in the primary, and oh my God, they can't vote. So we had folks here who were so excited to exercise that right, and came into a natural coalition with us, because they felt, well, why should I choose a party when I've registered to vote in this way? And so that was a coalition that came about, and it was amazing. And we already had other coalitions. We had faith-based coalitions, and we had some around food security issues. So different, as you said, issue-oriented. It was amazing the way all of these people were talking, and they were all talking at the end of the day about holding politicians accountable, about getting them to work for most of us. And we just happened to have a primary election in one ward where there were 10 candidates on the ballot. And so I didn't even have to come up with like a fantasy kind of example. It was just laid out for us. There were so many people were frustrated because they would have loved to have ranked and could not. And so that was just like, that was fairy dust for us. It was great.
Hey, John, I'm seeing a lot of chat on combo RCV.
Yeah, I actually want to start us off by going to Joe Smith, to ask that question, because a bunch of people have asked it. And Joe, why don't you represent the group who's asking this? Go ahead.
Okay, well, my question is, would have been in Arizona, would it have been easier to sell a top two system? Ranked choice voting seemed to really confuse the issue here. A lot of people I talked to really fell for the line. You know, the opposition was claiming ranked choice voting was too confusing, et cetera, and it just confused a lot of voters, I think. So
Joe,
do we need to simplify it the next time?
Joe, you're running the next campaign. That's exactly 100% right. We got too cute with the lawyers. I mean, we were trying to be thoughtful in terms of legalizing ranked choice through the back door, with the full knowledge that it would never happen. But they used that as a wedge issue to confuse people very effectively. Again, in an environment where we couldn't compete because we were quiet because of the court case. But yeah, if my recommendation, if we do this again in Arizona, we go to top two and just sell top two. I saw a chat in there too about, well, I heard a lot of Democrats said, well, they wouldn't get a statewide candidate. I don't believe that's true in Arizona because Arizona is a third, a third, and a third, as you know, Joe. And I know there's a bunch of other our supporters on the phone today. I saw some really good friends on here, so there's other people that know as well. But we're about a third and a third, a third.
I mean, but part of the problem is that in Arizona, this was a constitutional amendment. So we wrote it so that the form of the general election would not be a constitutional amendment, but open primaries would become part of the Constitution. And, you know, that makes a lot of sense, but it makes the whole thing more complicated.
Right.
And then by giving that, the way we wrote it, the legislature would have the latitude to determine how many top finishers go to the general election. And that was weaponized against us because we got a wacko legislature. So people said, oh, that's too much power to the legislature, when in fact, the legislature has the power now. We were not giving them. The only new power we gave them was the option of choosing ranked choice voting. So it just created a whole bowl of spaghetti of issues that really was used very effectively to confuse people, put out misinformation. But it is a problem putting top two in the Constitution as well, because it has a lot of problems. It's not necessarily the ideal solution. So then you got to go through the whole constitutional reform again if you're ever going to change that. So in my mind, you know, top two might have won, but then where would we be? So, you know, there's still a lot of food for thought. I don't think we've come to hard and fast conclusions, except I do agree with Chuck that both parties being in opposition and, you know, elected officials all being silent is a message that, you know, is hard to overcome in Arizona. We raised a lot of money. We raised a lot more money than has ever been raised for anything in Arizona, I believe. Is that true? True, Chuck?
It is. We raised $12 million in the cycle from Arizonans.
So the business community totally understands this, that our dysfunction in the public sector is a problem. It needs to be fixed. But the voters aren't really there. And yeah.
Did Lisa or Julie, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't. Just you know, the complication of Constitution, messing with the Constitution. We have our own issues in DC, which, you know, we are run by a home rule charter that comes, you know, Congress holds the hand on that. So we have our own peculiar issues, but nothing as delightful as it being a constitutional issue. So.
And I won't comment on the Arizona issue, but I will say that for Alaska, because we have a lot of independent candidates, like we've even had we had a unity gubernatorial where one was a Republican and one was a Democrat lieutenant governor on a ticket together. For us, it works as a system, right? So the open primary gives you 4 candidates that then move forward, and then you still have majority support. So I think that it's, again, the voting culture of each state is going to be different. You have to look at what works for the problems that you have in your state. But for Alaska, they are really, mixed together. And the way that the system works is as a system, not as two. There's not just a primary and there's not just a general election. It's moving,
Right.
3 competitive candidates sometimes up to that ranking, and you need that ranking to kind of get that majority support. And do we want the lower turnout primary deciding the top 2 that go up? I mean, in some states that's going to be the better move, but for our state, I think that this system is what works.
That just is so important, Julie. Like every state, it's not just different laws, it's different cultures, it's different political dynamics, it's different partisan dynamics. Like people need space to be able to develop a policy that is custom fit for their state. I think that's really important. I want to go to Maddie Miranda, who has a very interesting question about progressive opposition to open primaries. Go ahead, Maddie.
Thank you. And thank you for the folks that already answered a little bit. But so what I was seeing, and I was not on the ground, I'm in DC. So as Lisa said, we have a little bit of a different situation here. It's very colorful. But I did notice that a lot of the progressive caucuses were kind of opposed. And for example, a lot of the state parties, which lean progressive, were opposing these types of measures in the state. That's what we saw here as well. So in places where we see that trend, I'm wondering, looking back, what was their opposition? Was it just we don't want to change because we're in power? Was it something else? And maybe have we started thinking about what messaging might work in order to bring that coalition to the table?
Yeah, Maddie, this is such a good question. And here in DC, because this began as a ranked choice voting legislative push in 21, and then evolved to include opening the primaries to independents. Of course, there's been lots of conversation, but that ranked choice voting conversation began with the Progressive Caucus. And so there was, wait a minute, these independents. And so what we find now, we've won, and a lot of people want ranked choice voting so bad, they like held their nose and they're like, I don't know about this opening primaries, but we need it. So we need ranked choice voting so bad in DC that we'll just take and we'll deal with it. But when we go to the council, because that's our next step, because we need funding, our lobbying plan in the council, that there's a middle part of the council that fear independence. They fear independence because they don't know us. My hunch, and we'll have data, when we go in, but my hunch is that the independents really reflect the ideology of registered Democrats. When in a place like DC, when the super majority of people are one party, those people have defaulted. Many of those people have defaulted to registering as Democrats because the primary is the only game in town. And so here in DC, that is what we know. We know that people who want to be a part of the game, so to speak, so much, that they're not like me. I'm not going to be partisan. So I gave up my right to vote in a primary. But most folks, like I know a ton of Republicans, they're Republicans, but they're registered as Democrats because they want to vote in the primary, the only election that counts in DC. And I think we'll have that data. And so when we go to that middle crowd on the council, when we want to get our funding, we're going to say, yeah, look, these people that identify as independents, they're ideologically, they're exactly like the Democrats. But we just need to go in with that data.
All right, we're going to go to Gene Krebs. Gene has 2 questions about structure and data. So go ahead, Gene.
Thank you. First question is, tell us about your grassroots. How was it structured? How did you have it outsourced at all? Who'd you outsource it to? Did you have contributing partners? Did you do home parties? That type of stuff. And the second thing is, would love to see some matchups here on a precinct by precinct level of the various states in the city as to how it matches up on your partisan histories, So we know by which precincts that historically voted yes, voted no, R voted yes, voted no, but also most importantly, be able to match it up on income level. Because I'm doing this hypothesis here in Ohio that certain groups that the more educated they are may find some of these reforms more instantly understandable. And so I'm trying to get that, if that is true or not, or if it's based upon another aspect of the voting public. That's my question.
We're gonna dig into all that data. The canvas just got done out here, and so we're gonna go under the hood on all that, and we'll get all that information. I'll be happy to provide it to John, and John can provide it to everybody else. But those are all questions I want to answer, so we'll get them to you.
Thank you.
One thing about that, Gene, I think it's a real, it's something we have to pay attention to, because if our movement and our issues only resonate with high income, we should pack it up. We should just pack it up. We've got to find a message that connects with the broad swath of the American people. Otherwise, it's not democracy reform. It's making life easier for the elites. And that's just not going to fly. But I'll get Chuck's data out when we have it.
Well, you're exactly right. And the flaw, the worry is that so let's say you go up on the ballot in 2025. We do know that college educated have an 80% voting rate, non-college educated have a 35% voting rate. However, what that means is that every time they want to repeal it, they'll go on a repeal ballot in a presidential year.
Yep.
So you need to understand this, and then also I'd love to see a breakdown to our 5 core values. How'd your messaging go? What's your TV advertising look like? Your streaming advertising, radio advertising? That's the stuff that we really need to see. Thank you.
I want to go to Robert Bertrand. Go ahead, Robert. Oh, you're on mute.
You're muted,
take
Bob.
yourself off mute. You're on mute, Robert.
Bob, you're
Myself
muted.
got it.
There you are.
Okay, I'm from Arizona, and I work with Chuck and Sarah and the rest of the team. I think just mention one thing. I worked on the effort to get dark money passed in 2022, and we were successful. Partly, I think, because it went through, I believe, 3 rounds of voting, over 3 different legislative periods, and got a lot of support eventually. So it took time. But in Arizona, I think one of the big problems was that it was had to be referred to the legislature as to whether it was going to be 2, 3, 4, or 5, and if it's more than 2, then it went to ranked choice voting, as has been mentioned. But in our state, the attitude toward our legislature is very negative. There are and probably rightly so, frankly. We've got a lot of very weird people in our legislature. So when people said, "Oh, it's got to be referred to our legislature," that was a killer. That was a stake in the heart of it. People say, "There's no way I want this to have to go to the legislature," and that's why I think a lot of people were saying it's just got to be top 2. It's too. And plus, it's awfully confusing. Then it goes to ranked choice voting. So I'm curious, in other states where that were successful or not successful, did it have to be referred to the legislature for any purpose? And if so, or if not, what was the reaction, and what would have been the reaction if it had to be referred to the legislature? So I guess I'm asking both Alaska and Washington, any other state where it went down.
In Alaska, ours was both the movement to put it in place and to repeal it are citizens initiatives. So the legislature actually doesn't have they have an ability, once the initiative has been filed, to take it off the ballot by passing legislation that is similar to it, substantially similar, but they don't have an ability to change it or delay implementation or anything like that.
So what would have been the reaction had it been referred or required, if there had been a requirement to refer to the legislature? How would they have reacted, do you think? The voters.
The voters, how would the voters have reacted? Oh, I'm not sure that this system has been in place the whole time we've had it, so I'm not sure that I'm not sure it would have made much of a difference to the voters to know it would have to go for legislative approval or not. I think that, but You know, Alaska has a kind of, it's not, I think, as low as California is, but it has a kind of low threshold, and we've had a lot of initiatives come and go. So I think folks are kind of used to that way. I'm not sure I could hypothesize about how they would have voted differently had the legislature had a bite at the apple.
And how about Washington? Did it have to go to the council for any kind of forward progress?
For funding, they have to approve, just like any piece of legislation, whether the legislation comes out of the council or it's citizen initiative, then they have to appropriate funds for it. And which is, you know, that's the fight. That's the next fight. But I will tell you, we have such a wacky council that they will write their own legislation and then not fund it. I mean, so you know, every step of the way there's a fight, and the next thing will be getting the funding and getting it done on time. And we have a couple of people in the council that are already using media surrogates to say, oh yeah, but not until 28. So it's, you know, they
Chuck and Sarah, you might address that, because again, I think when I talk to people, they say, I want nothing to do with our legislature. It's got to go.
I agree with you, Bob. I've already reached that same conclusion, that that's not a mistake we would make on the rebound here. We just go top two and sell top two. And
dilemma is we did all these things for good reasons.
Yeah.
And a lot of people looked at what we did and they said, it's beautiful. Arizona's really come up with this great solution. And, you know, you'd hear that in one ear, and then in the other ear, you'd hear, well, that's the death knell. And so it's like striking the right balance between really thoughtful reform and what you can get passed.
Yep.
And it was a very frustrating experience because people, you know, my favorite quote, one of them ever, is Albert Einstein: make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. And, you know, there we are. You know, we were caught in that dilemma. And so it's very frustrating. But I think, you know, when you're trying to solve a problem with the legislature, it's sort of a no hope situation.
Yep. All right, we're going to stay in Arizona for one more question. Then we're going to Mike Cantwell. Then we're going to Gary Sass. So I'm going to move things along here, but I want to stay in Arizona because an article just came out today. So go ahead, Ken. Ask Ken Martin. Go ahead, ask your question.
I'm not sure which question you're referring to, John.
Oh, you had a bunch in there? Oh, it was about this article that came out about independent voters.
It was an article that came out nationally, and basically it was talking about the independents were a larger share of voters in 2024 in the presidential election. And they jumped up by quite a bit. And in fact, they almost passed up the Republicans. And so the question in my mind is that should we be working, since independents are big in Arizona, should we be working and having a focus on trying to get the independent voters more deeply involved in helping to get this passed?
Well, that's happening, Ken. I mean, we're doing that. It's hard putting a net around independence. I think we all know that.
Oh, yeah.
It's not something that's easily, oh, let's all meet in phone booth over here. Because everybody, the beauty of independence is they all think on their own. They're all proud Americans. They all explain, we all have these characteristics, and that rebels against conformity. And so we did the best.
I agree with you. I would think, though, that from my experience and dealing with it a little bit on this issue is that I like to consider that the independents are more of a thinking voter than a lot of the others are. And maybe there's a way of getting, talking to them, by getting involved and talking to them, get them to be participants in that on the basis of being a thinking voter.
I think that comes down to some of the messaging stuff we talked about.
Yeah.
And praising them for that independence, because that's it's really what makes America special, is that we are independent. We are individual. We're a country that empowers individuals, and our election system no longer does that. It rewards conformity, and we have to get back to what the founders believed is we were empowering individuals, and that's what this is about.
You'll appreciate this, but I came to Arizona when Ev Meekum became governor.
You and I were birthed in the same election cycle out here, remember?
Wow, long time.
McCain, and watch that thing happen. So quite fun.
All right, we're going to go to Mike Cantwell. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, thanks a lot, John. I personally don't think we should give up on the legislative strategy.
Yep.
Here in Virginia, we were successful to pass the ranked choice voting local option bill. Kimberly, can you mute, please? Kimberly, can you?
Yeah,
Thank
she
you.
just did.
So several years ago, we got the ranked choice voting for local option passed through the House, the Senate, signed by the governor. And then now we have done ranked choice voting local option in Arlington and Charlottesville. So that's ranked choice voting. I think we could use the same model for nonpartisan primaries. It's usually most effective in the legislative strategy if you focus the bills on elections that don't affect the legislators. So if you can target, you can say this will be a local option bill, or you can say this only applies to federal elections, right? So the hardest thing to do is to try to get, elected officials to change the rules on their own election. So let's not give up on the legislative strategy. I think every state you can do it that way. There's only a limited number of states that have ballot initiatives. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, no, I'm really sitting back very impressed by all the work that many of you have done. It's pretty exemplary. But and I agree with the comment that was made earlier that it's hard to generalize about state elections because of unique history and culture. But I want to draw that back to what we can do, nationally, and what lessons we learned about things, to work on going forward. One question I think is very fundamental, and it probably differs from state to state, is do you want to play an inside or an outside game?
Yeah.
We in Rhode Island, because of who we are, play an inside game. And what we've learned over the last couple of years is that you have to, if you can play the inside game and the outside game, you can't eschew electoral politics. And I've heard no conversation today about maybe the first step is electing people to the general assemblies of the state legislatures that really are interested in what we're talking about. And without that kind of base, it becomes very difficult. The second point I heard was talk about what should be in a constitution or what shouldn't be in a constitution. And I think some national technical assistance and advice would be very helpful. For example, in a constitution, I don't think any of us would disagree that you ought to define whether the successful candidate gets a majority or a plurality. That's a constitutional question. It's the form of voting. It's not a constitutional question, whether it's ranked choice or top two, or so what some people come up with, 5 years from now. That needs to be changed if it doesn't work. And having that kind of prescription in a constitution is a question I have, but certainly not the question of plurality or majority. There's certain fundamentals that belong in the Constitution. I've heard no discussion about that. And the third point I want to make is the conversation has been largely about, process, important questions if you're down on the ground trying to get this thing done. But people are concerned about quality of their schools. They're concerned about public safety. They're concerned about having a job, having a good economic climate in the state. They're concerned about not living in a corrupt place that's subject to scandal. And so how do you tie, which I haven't heard much discussion about, what we want to do on electoral reform to what people really care about? And I get amused sometimes when we talk about, independence. And I was very much involved in the no labels thing on the Unity ticket. So I had that history recently. But I was very concerned because most of the independents that we deal with and trying to get people to work together fall into two groups. Elite intellectuals who are truly independent and will engage in some very important conversations on how you do this effectively or do anything effectively. And the other independents, they lean, whether they lean conservative or liberal, Democrat or Republican, they may not know they're leaning, but there's a built-in, bias because of the climate they live in, the contacts, culture, et cetera. So I'd like to see, John, some conversation, nationally to help states with those kinds of issues so we could build an infrastructure. Can't substitute for what each state is doing, but having a conversation about the nuts and bolts in a state, really.
I agree. I
really
totally
help
agree.
us.
I mean, I think we need national campaigns. This is something I'm going to try to raise some money for early next year. Is, for example, there's going to be close the primary bills introduced in probably a dozen states next year. Well, we can fight them quietly in the dark in each individual state, or we can create a national campaign so that every voter in America associates closing the primaries with self-interested, power-hungry politicians who want to deprive voters of their rights. And that's going to help campaigns emerge around the country. But it's hard. It's hard. People want to invest their money in getting immediate wins, and that's something we have to kind of deconstruct, is the need for this kind of foundation building so that campaigns can be successful when we do them.
And I would suggest that, it is hard, but there's certain shortcuts or things that we can do because we can't cross every T and dot every I because but if we can develop a national effort to have the kind of conversation on the issues that I've outlined and probably others to begin to build this national movement, I think that would certainly be helpful to us. We came very close this year to getting top 2 because we were working with the Speaker and the President of the Senate, and unfortunately, one of our biggest supporters, the President of the Senate, developed a serious health problem and couldn't put the energy in for his personal.
You guys will get it done.
Reasons, yeah, but unfortunately, the contractor was diagnosed with cancer, and that certainly had to take focus and work on that.
Yeah.
But I know every state can't work that way. But I found through the conversation we were able to sell electoral reform to the leadership because I'll give it a kind of very parochial thing. We had a major bridge disaster in the state. Still have it.
Hey,
The
Gary,
governor-
I hate to cut you
Oh,
off.
I will-
We have one last question I want to get to, and then we have to wrap up. We're going to go to
Okay.
Marissa in Wyoming. Bring us home, Marissa.
Hi, sorry, I dropped a question in the chat a while ago, but I was wondering how everybody combated voter apathy and the apathy of institutions, because we're finding that in Wyoming that people are just sick and tired of it. So just wondering what you all did to reinvigorate people and get them interested in elections and voting.
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, that is, it's not just a voting thing. It's people are disaffected from everything. I mean, that's the essence of MAGA, is to understand that, and how disaffected voters are. I just keep coming back. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. But the idea that I keep coming back to is individual American values, those things that have resonated over time in this country about individual liberty, individual freedom, honoring the individual, and fairness and equality and justice, which are all themes of the civil rights movement and all things that we need to recapture here, because I think it can bring people together. I think if you give them a place to go, that it can bring people together. I don't know that. I mean, I'm making a guess, but I'd like to get with I know there's Unite America people on here, and they've done a great job, and there's other groups that we need to get a message platform in place that that reflects those enduring American values that I think can help overcome that apathy and that disaffection. And that's the only thing I have, that is the idea to go back to that.
And I might just add on a little bit on that. I think that there's a lot of, big themes we need to talk about, but also bringing it down. And I think it's just like getting the coalitions of diverse people, but bring it down to, if you have concrete examples in your state, we were able to point to a big piece of legislation failing by one vote, right? And to kind of, the big theme is one vote is important, and I was able to take it to your vote is important because it elects the one person that cast the one vote that killed this bill that would have funded your schools, right? So and I think that that's one of the things that we're still grappling with, and I think as a movement we have to look at, how do we connect election reform to people who need to get their groceries and pick up their kids and maybe vote every once in a while. You know, it's almost like telling them to eat their vegetables sometimes. And I think that was one of our challenges in the campaign. And food for thought for everyone, right, is how do we connect that to the people that are going to be out there voting? Because election reform can seem very esoteric to a lot of folks.
No, that's the challenge. We have to wrap. We have a bunch more questions. I wish we could get to all of them, but we can't. Thank you, Lisa, Julie, Chuck, Sarah. This was great. There is a 2-question poll that is in the chat. Danny Batista has put it in there. If you can take a minute, want to ask you some questions about what you saw this year and also other guests you'd like to see. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful holiday season. We will see you in 2025 with our work gloves on, ready to get at it.
Yeah, go out swinging.
Take care, everybody. Happy holidays.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.